Before the Great Depression began, the world seemed bright and full of promise. It was the 1920s, the time people later called the Roaring Twenties. The name fit perfectly. Cities were growing, music was lively, cars filled the roads, and airplanes dotted the skies. For the first time, many families could dream bigger than ever before. It felt as if nothing could go wrong. Just a few years earlier, the world had gone through the terrible First World War. Millions had died, and cities across Europe had been destroyed. When the war finally ended in 1918, people everywhere wanted peace and happiness again. They were tired of sadness, fear, and loss. They wanted to laugh, to dance, and to live. In the United States, the 1920s began with hope. Soldiers returned home. Industries shifted from building weapons to making everyday goods, and factories started producing cars, radios, refrigerators, and clothes for ordinary people. It was a time of invention, ambition, and excitement. Imagine living in a time when almost everything felt new. Electricity was reaching homes across cities and towns. Telephones connected people who had never spoken across long distances before. And perhaps the biggest change of all was the car. Henry Ford's invention of the assembly line made it possible to build cars faster and cheaper. His famous Model T car became a symbol of the new age. Ordinary workers could now afford something that had once only been for the rich. Soon, millions of Americans were driving cars, and roads, gas stations, and motels appeared across the country. Factories were busy. People had jobs. Shops were filled with goods. If you walked down a city street in 1925, you'd see bright shop windows, hear jazz music spilling from clubs, and smell freshly baked bread or roasted coffee from nearby cafes. Everything seemed alive. As people earned more, they wanted to make their money grow even faster. The stock market, a place where people buy and sell small pieces of companies, became a popular way to do that. At first, only wealthy people bought stocks, but soon middle-class families joined in too. Banks encouraged it. "You don't need much money to invest," they said. "Buy stocks now and pay later." People could borrow money to buy stocks, hoping the price would rise and they could sell them for a profit. It seemed like magic. Making money without working more hours. By the late 1920s, millions of Americans were buying stocks. The value of the stock market kept climbing higher and higher. Newspapers printed headlines like, "Stocks will never fall." It felt like a game that everyone was winning. But deep down, something was wrong. Even while the city sparkled, not everyone shared the wealth. In the countryside, farmers were struggling. During World War I, they had grown huge amounts of crops to feed soldiers and countries in need. They borrowed money to buy more land and better machines. But after the war, the demand dropped, prices fell, and farmers were left with debts they couldn't repay. In factories, many workers earned just enough to get by, even as company owners became very rich. The gap between the rich and poor was growing fast. And while the economy looked strong on the surface, it was built on fragile ground: loans, speculation, and hope. Imagine a tall tower made of cards. It looks impressive, but one wrong move and it all comes crashing down. Despite these problems, the 1920s also brought incredible cultural change. Music, movies, and art were booming. Jazz, born from African American communities, spread across the country. In dance halls, people moved to the fast rhythm of trumpets and pianos. It was energetic, joyful, and wild, a sound that matched the spirit of the time. Movies became a favorite pastime. People crowded into theaters to watch silent films, and later, talkies, movies with sound. For the first time, movie stars like Charlie Chaplin and Greta Garbo became household names. Advertisements filled newspapers and billboards, showing the latest fashions, perfumes, and appliances. Women, too, were changing their roles in society. In many countries, they had recently won the right to vote. They began working outside the home, going to college, and dressing in new, freer styles. The flapper, a young woman with short hair, stylish clothes, and bold confidence, became a symbol of independence and modern life. It was a decade of freedom, laughter, and fast living, but like a storm building behind a clear sky, trouble was on its way. During the 1920s, a new idea changed how people shopped. Buy now, pay later. It was called credit. Stores advertised, take it home today, pay in small amounts each month. Families bought furniture, radios, and cars this way. It seemed wonderful at first. Everyone could enjoy modern life without waiting. But this new habit also created a silent problem: debt. People owed money to banks and stores. They were spending more than they earned, trusting that tomorrow would be even better. And as long as everyone believed that the good times would last forever, no one saw the danger. Newspapers wrote stories of success. A man who invested $500 in the stock market and became a millionaire. A factory worker who quit his job because his stocks made more money than his wages. It was a time when people thought nothing could go wrong. But deep inside the economy, things were unbalanced. Companies produced more goods than people could afford to buy. Farmers grew more crops than the market needed. And many people had borrowed too much to buy cars, houses, and especially stocks. The economy was like a balloon, growing bigger and bigger, full of air, not substance. And one day, that balloon would burst. The Great Depression wasn't only an American story. It became a worldwide crisis. But before it spread, many other nations were already weak. Europe was still recovering from World War I. Countries like Germany were paying huge war debts. Factories were destroyed, and governments borrowed heavily to rebuild. When the U.S. economy began to shake, the world felt the tremors too. At first, few people noticed. Trade seemed normal. Ships carried goods across oceans, and foreign companies invested in the Americans' booming market. But soon those financial ties would pull every country into the same collapse. By 1928 and 1929, a few wise economists began to worry. They saw that stock prices were far higher than the real value of the companies. They warned that a crash could come, but most people laughed. The newspapers called them pessimists and said they didn't understand the new world. Factories were overproducing, warehouses were filling up, farmers were losing money, but the stock market kept climbing, higher than ever before. It was like everyone was dancing on a thin sheet of ice, unaware that it was beginning to crack. In the summer of 1929, life looked good. Cities were full of lights and laughter. Families planned vacations. People listened to the radio, danced to jazz, and read about record-breaking stock prices in the papers. But by September, small warnings appeared. Stock prices began to slip. At first, only a little, nothing too serious. Investors told each other not to worry. The market always goes up again, they said. But this time, it didn't. In October 1929, something happened that no one expected. Within a few days, the world's strongest economy would collapse. Banks would fail. Factories would close. Millions would lose their jobs. And the laughter of the Roaring Twenties would fall silent. The story of the 1920s teaches us something important. When people believe that good times will never end, they often take risks without thinking of the future. When governments ignore the warning signs, small problems can grow into huge disasters. And when society forgets the poor while celebrating the rich, the balance breaks. The Great Depression was not just a sudden event. It was the result of many years of small mistakes hidden beneath the surface of success. The world was about to face one of the darkest decades in history, but also one that would teach humanity how to rebuild, how to help one another, and how to start again. It began quietly, no thunder, no warning, no sound of disaster in the air, just numbers. Numbers that had been climbing for years suddenly started to fall. And before anyone truly understood what was happening, the entire economy of the United States began to collapse. This was October 1929, the month the world changed forever. At first, only a few people noticed. Stock prices dipped a little on a Thursday, not unusual. But by the next week, the dip turned into a drop, and the drop became a plunge. Panic spread like wildfire. In those days, people didn't trade stocks online like we do now. They had to go to a building called the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street. It was always busy, men in suits shouting, papers flying, telephones ringing. But on October 24, 1929, the noise became something else, the sound of fear. That day became known as Black Thursday. Thousands of people tried to sell their stocks at once. Prices fell faster than anyone could count. Crowds gathered outside the exchange, staring up at the ticker board that printed stock prices. Each new number was lower than the last. Inside, chaos reigned. Some investors cried. Others shouted for buyers who no longer existed. One trader later said it was like trying to stop the sea with your hands. Banks and brokers tried to calm the situation. Big businessmen like J.P. Morgan gathered in secret meetings to buy stocks and restore confidence. For a brief moment, it worked. The next day, prices rose slightly, and newspapers printed hopeful headlines. But it didn't last. By Monday, October 28th, fear returned, worse than before. And then came Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, forever remembered as Black Tuesday, the day the stock market crashed completely. In just one day, billions of dollars vanished, fortunes disappeared. People who had been rich in the morning were poor by nightfall. The ticker machines, which printed prices on paper, fell behind by hours because prices were changing so quickly. No one knew what anything was worth anymore. Some people fainted, some shouted, some simply stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. One man said it was like the end of the world. But the stock market crash was not just about numbers. It was about people. Millions of ordinary Americans had invested their savings, hoping to build a better future. They had borrowed money from banks to buy those stocks. Now the stocks were worthless, but the debts remained. Banks demanded repayment. People couldn't pay. And soon, banks themselves began to fail. When a bank runs out of money, it closes its doors. And when that happens, everyone who kept their savings there loses everything. There was no insurance back then, no government safety net. If your bank closed, your money was gone forever. In the months after the crash, this happened again and again. Bank after bank shut down. Families lined up outside hoping to withdraw their money, but the doors stayed locked. The crash didn't just stay on Wall Street. It spread everywhere. Factories began to close. Companies that made cars, clothes, and radios suddenly had no buyers. Workers were laid off. When they lost their jobs, they stopped buying things too. That meant other factories had to close as well. It was like a chain reaction, one failure leading to another. This is what economists call a domino effect. A farmer who couldn't sell his crops stopped buying tools. The toolmaker lost his job and stopped buying clothes. The tailor lost business and couldn't pay his rent, and the landlord couldn't pay the bank. Everything was connected, and when one part fell, the whole system shook. In big cities like New York and Chicago, the effects were visible everywhere. The streets that once buzzed with cars and laughter now looked empty. Shops closed, lights went dark, and lines of people formed outside soup kitchens. Men in worn-out suits waited for a bowl of soup or a piece of bread. People sold their furniture, their jewelry, even their clothes, just to buy food. Some moved in with relatives. Others wandered from town to town searching for work that didn't exist. Newspapers called it the Great Depression. It was more than an economic crisis. It was a human tragedy. While city workers struggled, farmers faced their own disaster. In the early 1930s, terrible droughts hit the Central Plains of America. The soil, already weak from years of overfarming, began to turn to dust. Strong winds lifted the dry earth into the air, creating giant dust storms that darkened the sky. People called it the Dust Bowl. Houses were buried under layers of dirt. Crops withered. Cows and chickens died. Children coughed as the dust filled their lungs. Entire towns were swallowed by brown clouds that blocked out the sun. Thousands of families packed their belongings into old trucks and left their homes behind. They traveled west, especially to California, hoping to find jobs on farms or in factories. But when they arrived, they found the same story: no work, no money, and no hope. Imagine a man named Thomas who worked in a car factory in Detroit. He had a wife and 2 children. For years he earned a good wage and saved a little money. He bought stocks because everyone said it was safe. Then the crash came. The factory closed. The bank took his savings. He sold his car and furniture, but it wasn't enough. Soon his family was living in a small shack made of scrap wood and tin, part of a settlement the newspapers called Hoovervilles, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for doing too little to help. Thomas's story was not unusual. It was the story of millions. The Great Depression was not just about money. It was about dignity. Proud men who had worked hard all their lives now stood in lines asking for food. Mothers skipped meals so their children could eat. Families burned broken furniture to keep warm during winter. Children left school to help earn money, doing odd jobs or selling newspapers. People lost not only their homes, but also their sense of purpose. Newspapers printed stories of families sleeping under bridges or in cardboard huts. In New York City alone, thousands wandered the streets every night searching for warmth. It was a time when even small acts of kindness meant everything. A loaf of bread shared, a coat given to a stranger, a neighbor offering a place to sleep. President Herbert Hoover believed the crisis would fix itself. He thought the economy would recover naturally if people worked hard and stayed calm. He said, "Prosperity is just around the corner." But the corner never came. Many Americans grew angry. They felt abandoned. They wanted their government to step in, to create jobs, to feed the hungry, to rebuild confidence. But in those early years, very little help arrived. Public protests began. In 1932, a group of World War I veterans called the Bonus Army marched to Washington, D.C. They demanded early payment of the money promised to them for their military service. The government refused and sent soldiers to drive them away. Tear gas filled the air. The nation watched in shock. It was clear that something had to change. The Great Depression didn't stay within American borders. Other countries felt it too, and some even worse. Germany, already struggling to pay war reparations after World War I, saw its economy collapse completely. Unemployment soared. Factories shut down. People lost faith in their government. In this chaos, extremist groups, including Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party, began to rise, promising strength, order, and recovery. In Britain, France, and Canada, people faced similar hardships: long lines for food, closed factories, and political unrest. In Latin America, the fall of U.S. trade ruined local economies. Even Japan, across the ocean, faced industrial slowdowns. The world economy was like a web, and when one part broke, the whole thing tore apart. It's hard to imagine the sadness and fear people felt then. One day, they had jobs, homes, and savings. The next, they had nothing. Many families moved constantly, chasing rumors of work. Fathers hitchhiked between towns, leaving letters for their families at post offices. Some never returned. For children, it was confusing. They didn't understand why their parents cried at night, why they moved from place to place, or why Christmas came and went with no gifts. People lost hope. Some newspapers reported stories of despair, of men who ended their lives after losing everything. It was a dark time that tested the very spirit of humanity. By 1932, the United States was in its deepest crisis. More than 13 million Americans were unemployed, about 1 in every 4 workers. Thousands of banks had failed. Factories stood silent. The gross national product, the measure of all the goods and services a country makes, had fallen nearly 50%. It was as if the entire heartbeat of the nation had slowed down. And yet, in the middle of all this despair, something remarkable was about to happen. A new leader was rising, one who promised hope, action, and a new deal for the American people. The next chapter of this story would not be about loss, but about rebuilding, brick by brick, job by job, dream by dream. When the Great Depression hit, it did not strike all at once like a storm. It spread slowly, from the stock market to banks, from cities to small towns, and finally into every home. Almost every person felt its weight. It was a time when money was short, jobs were rare, and hope was often the only thing people had left. Imagine it's 1931. You wake up early, not because you have work, but because you hope to find some. You walk down cold streets with hundreds of other men, all wearing the same tired look. Coat collars turned up, hats pulled low. Some carry lunch pails with nothing inside but a piece of bread. Factories have closed. Shops have locked their doors. And even the newspapers, once full of job ads, now only print stories of despair. You wait outside a factory gate, hoping someone will shout, "We need one more worker." But no one does. By noon, your feet ache and your stomach growls. But you keep walking, because going home empty-handed is harder than walking all day. This was the reality for millions of people during the Great Depression. In every major city, lines began to form. Long, silent lines of people waiting for food. Churches, charities, and kind neighbors opened what were called soup kitchens. They served hot soup and bread to anyone who came, no questions asked. The most famous of these was run by a man named Al Capone, a gangster from Chicago. He opened a soup kitchen that served thousands every day. The irony was strange. A man once known for crime, now feeding the hungry when the government could not. In these soup lines, everyone was equal, rich or poor, young or old. They all stood side by side, holding empty bowls. And even though the food was simple, watery soup and stale bread, it meant survival. As jobs disappeared and banks failed, people could no longer pay rent or mortgages. Families lost their homes. Some moved in with relatives, but many had nowhere to go. Across America, small groups of homeless families began building makeshift shelters on empty land. They used scrap wood, cardboard, tin, and anything they could find. They called these tiny towns Hoovervilles, named bitterly after President Hoover, who they blamed for their suffering. In the biggest Hoovervilles, like the one in New York's Central Park, thousands of people lived side by side in rows of shacks. At night, fires burned in rusty barrels to keep warm. When it rained, the roofs leaked. When it snowed, the walls froze. Children played with sticks and stones, pretending they were toys. But even in these rough places, there was a sense of community. People helped each other. A man who found an extra loaf of bread would share it. A woman who found a blanket would cover a child shivering nearby. While cities faced hunger, the countryside was in crisis too. Farmers had already been struggling since the 1920s, and now things became worse than ever. In the Great Plains, stretching from Texas to the Dakotas, a terrible drought struck. Year after year, no rain came. The sun burned the soil, and the wind began to blow it away. Without moisture, the earth turned to dust. Strong winds carried that dust for miles, black clouds rolling across the land. People called it the Dust Bowl. The dust storms were terrifying. They covered everything: houses, cars, even people. The air turned brown and hard to breathe. Farmers couldn't grow crops. Animals died. Families packed up their belongings and drove west, hoping to start again in California. These migrants became known as Okies because many came from Oklahoma. They traveled in old trucks loaded with mattresses, pots, and furniture, tied with rope. But when they reached California, they found there was no magic waiting, only more poverty. Thousands of families lived in camps beside fields, picking fruit for a few cents a day. Author John Steinbeck would later write about their struggles in his famous novel, The Grapes of Wrath. The Great Depression was especially hard for children. Many stopped going to school because their parents couldn't afford clothes, books, or lunch money. Some schools closed completely because the towns couldn't pay teachers. Children learned to grow up fast. They sold newspapers, shined shoes, or collected bottles for a few pennies. In some cities, small boys rode freight trains across the country, hoping to find work or food somewhere else. Families often tried to protect their children from worry. Mothers would smile and say, "Everything will be fine," even when there was no dinner that night. Fathers pretended to go job hunting just to give their children hope. But kids noticed. They saw their parents' faces, tired, thin, and full of silent fear. In small towns, life slowed down almost completely. People began to trade goods instead of using money. A farmer might give eggs to the barber in exchange for a haircut. The tailor might fix clothes in return for bread. Neighbors helped each other survive. If one family had milk, another had potatoes, and they shared. People grew vegetables in their backyards, victory gardens, they called them. Old clothes were patched again and again. Shoes were mended until the soles gave out. In these hard times, thrift and kindness became the greatest treasures. Even in sadness, people searched for joy. Radio became a window to the outside world, a voice that gave comfort. Families gathered around it in the evenings to listen to news, dramas, and music. The songs of that era were full of both sorrow and hope. Bing Crosby's soft voice sang, "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" a song that became the anthem of the Depression. Others turned to jazz or country music to forget their troubles for a while. Movies also gave people an escape. For a few cents, you could enter a dark theater and forget your worries. Hollywood made films filled with laughter, dance, and dreams. Famous stars like Shirley Temple, with her bright smile, gave people a reason to believe in happiness again. Labor unions, groups of workers who fought for fair pay and conditions, grew stronger during these years. Factory workers protested against wage cuts and dangerous conditions. Farmers organized penny auctions, where they saved each other's farms by bidding only a few cents to keep banks from taking them away. But protests were not always peaceful. Police sometimes used force to break them up. In one famous event, the Ford Hunger March of 1932, thousands of unemployed auto workers marched in Detroit. When police fired on them, several were killed. The tragedy shocked the nation. People began to realize that this was not just an economic problem, it was a human crisis demanding action. Today, if a person loses their job, there are unemployment benefits or government programs to help. But in the early 1930s, none of that existed. There was no Social Security, no welfare, no food stamps. If you lost your job, you were on your own. Many people turned to their churches, charities, or local communities for help. Soup kitchens, food drives, and church donations kept countless families alive, but there was never enough for everyone. In some small towns, mayors and police officers gave out coal, clothes, or blankets to the needy. Teachers quietly fed hungry children with food from their own homes. Acts of kindness became small lights in the darkness. Women played a crucial role during the Depression. They stretched every dollar, repaired old clothes, and cooked meals from almost nothing. A pot of soup might feed a whole family for days. They saved buttons, used flour sacks to make dresses, and found creative ways to keep the home running. Some women began working outside the home, taking jobs as nurses, teachers, or seamstresses. Others sold baked goods, took in laundry, or rented out spare rooms. Even young girls helped by sewing or helping in neighbors' kitchens. Their strength, patience, and determination held many families together when everything else was falling apart. Beyond hunger and poverty, the Depression brought something else: shame. People felt embarrassed to ask for help. In a country that had always believed in hard work and success, failure felt like a personal fault, not a national crisis. Letters to newspapers showed the heartbreak. "I can't feed my children. My husband looks for work every day, but there's nothing. What should we do? We were once happy and proud. Now we live in a tent." Despite all this, kindness and courage still existed. Neighbors shared. Strangers helped strangers. Communities stood together. People learned that even in poverty, dignity could survive. The suffering was not limited to America. In Europe, unemployment rose sharply. In Britain, long lines of jobless men formed outside factories. In Germany, despair gave rise to political extremism. In Asia and Latin America, trade collapsed and industry shut down. Around the world, governments faced the same question: how do we fix an economy that has stopped working? For now, few had answers, but change was coming, and it would begin with new leaders, new ideas, and bold action. In the midst of hardship, people found small joys: a cup of coffee shared with a neighbor, a warm blanket passed from one family to another, children playing stickball in the streets, music floating from an open window, a farmer's wife baking bread for the town's hungry kids. These small acts reminded everyone that life, even in its darkest times, could still hold light. By 1933, after years of despair, the people of the United States were ready for change. They wanted a leader who understood their pain, someone who could bring hope back to the nation. That leader was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who would soon promise a New Deal, a plan to rebuild the country, restore jobs, and renew faith in the future. The story of how he did it and how America began to recover begins in the next chapter. By 1933, the Great Depression had gripped the world for more than 3 years. Factories stood silent, banks were closed, farmers were ruined, and millions of people had lost faith in their governments. They had waited for help, but help never seemed to come. Something had to change, and in 1933, change finally began. In March 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, known as FDR, became the new President of the United States. He was confident, calm, and full of energy, everything the people needed in such a dark time. When he spoke, he didn't use complicated words. He spoke like a friend, reassuring and hopeful. In his very first speech as president, he said something that became famous: "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Those words gave courage to millions of Americans sitting by their radios. For the first time in years, they felt hope. Roosevelt promised action, not just talk. He said the government would no longer stand aside and watch people suffer. He called his plan the New Deal. Right after taking office, Roosevelt moved quickly. He began passing laws and programs to bring the country back to life. Historians call this time the first 100 days, one of the most active periods in American government history. The first crisis to solve was the banking collapse. People had lost all trust in banks. They hid their savings under mattresses or in jars. But the economy couldn't recover without banks. So FDR temporarily closed all banks for several days. This was called a bank holiday. Government inspectors checked each bank's accounts to make sure it was safe. When the banks reopened, Roosevelt spoke on the radio, explaining what had been done. He told people their money was now secure. It worked. Within days, people began returning to the banks and depositing their savings. Confidence started to return. Roosevelt understood something new: the power of communication. He used the radio to talk directly to the American people. He called these talks his fireside chats. Families would gather around their radios, listening to his calm voice. He explained complicated problems in simple language. Just like a teacher or a caring neighbor, he told people what the government was doing and why. It made Americans feel they were part of something together, not alone anymore. His voice brought comfort in homes where fear had lived for too long. To fix the economy, Roosevelt created many new government programs. Each had a different job: to create work, rebuild farms, protect savings, and restart industries. They became known by their short names or alphabet agencies. Let's look at some of the most important ones. 1. CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC gave jobs to young men between the ages of 18 and 25. They worked in forests, parks, and farms, planting trees, building trails, and preventing floods. They earned a small wage, and most of it was sent home to their families. In just a few years, the CCC planted over 3 billion trees and built hundreds of national parks. It gave young people not only work, but pride and purpose. 2. AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Farmers had suffered the most. The AAA tried to fix that. It paid farmers to grow fewer crops so prices could rise again. By reducing supply, it helped stabilize the farming industry. Not everyone agreed with this idea. Some said it was unfair to destroy crops while people were hungry, but it did help many farmers recover from years of loss. 3. NRA, National Recovery Administration. The NRA encouraged businesses to work together rather than against each other. It set fair wages, prices, and working hours to protect both employers and workers. Factories displayed a Blue Eagle logo in their windows to show they supported the program. People saw it as a sign of hope, a symbol that America was rebuilding. 4. TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. In the southern United States, especially in the Tennessee Valley, people lived in poverty with little electricity. The TVA built dams along rivers to produce hydroelectric power. This created jobs, prevented floods, and brought light to homes that had always been dark. The project turned one of the poorest regions in America into a place of opportunity. 5. FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This program gave direct money to states so they could provide food and shelter for the poor. For many families, this meant survival, a warm meal, a roof over their heads, or clothes for their children. These programs didn't fix everything overnight, but they gave people something they had lost: hope. They saw progress: men with shovels building roads, workers repairing bridges, families getting help from local offices. America was moving again. People started to believe in themselves and in their government. Even those who didn't get jobs through the programs felt proud to see others working again. It showed that something was being done. Not everyone supported Roosevelt's ideas. Some business owners complained that the government was becoming too powerful. They said too many rules and taxes would hurt freedom. Others, especially the poor, said the New Deal didn't go far enough. A priest named Father Coughlin spoke on the radio, demanding that banks be nationalized. A senator from Louisiana, Huey Long, proposed a plan called Share Our Wealth. He wanted to limit how rich people could be and give more money to the poor. Roosevelt listened to these critics, but he kept moving forward. He said, "We cannot build a healthy nation on the ruins of despair." By 1935, the first New Deal had made progress, but the Depression wasn't over. Millions were still unemployed. So FDR launched a new set of programs, the Second New Deal. This time, the focus was not just on emergency help, but on long-term security. 1. WPA, Works Progress Administration. The WPA became one of the largest job programs in history. It employed over 8 million people to build roads, schools, hospitals, bridges, and airports. But it didn't stop there. It also hired artists, musicians, writers, and actors. Painters created murals on public buildings. Writers documented local history. Musicians played free concerts in towns that had never heard live music before. The idea was simple: work brings dignity. 2. Social Security Act of 1935. Before the Depression, when people grew old or sick, they often had no support. The Social Security Act changed that forever. It created pensions for the elderly, unemployment insurance for those who lost jobs, and aid for the disabled and children in need. It was one of Roosevelt's proudest achievements, a safety net for generations to come. 3. National Labor Relations Act. Also known as the Wagner Act, this law protected the rights of workers to form unions and negotiate for better pay and conditions. It gave ordinary workers a voice and helped reduce conflict between employees and employers. Before the Great Depression, most people believed the government should stay out of the economy, but the crisis changed that belief. The New Deal proved that government could help people directly by creating jobs, protecting savings, and ensuring fairness. It was a new idea: the government as a protector of the people, not just a manager of laws. For some, this was revolutionary. For others, it was controversial. But for millions who had nothing, it was a lifeline. FDR himself became a symbol of strength. What made his story even more powerful was that he had suffered too. He had been paralyzed by polio years earlier and could not walk without leg braces. Yet he never showed weakness in public. He smiled, waved, and spoke with warmth. People felt that if he could overcome his struggles, maybe they could too. Newspapers printed photos of him beside children and farmers, smiling confidently. His courage became the nation's courage. While Roosevelt worked to rebuild America, other nations faced their own battles. In Britain, the government introduced public works programs and unemployment benefits. In France, political tensions grew between left and right groups. In Germany, Adolf Hitler used the Depression to gain power, promising jobs and national pride, a promise that would lead the world toward war. The Depression taught governments everywhere that economic despair could easily turn into political chaos. Not all of Roosevelt's programs survived. The Supreme Court struck down several New Deal laws, saying they gave too much power to the government. This angered FDR, who then tried to pass a plan to add more judges, a move critics called the court-packing plan. It caused controversy, but eventually the court began supporting his reforms. Even with challenges, the New Deal continued shaping America. By the late 1930s, the New Deal had transformed the way people saw each other. Instead of competition and isolation, there was cooperation and community. The idea of helping one another through work programs, unions, and government aid became part of American life. Murals painted by WPA artists showed farmers, workers, and builders together, symbols of unity. For many, the Depression had broken the spirit of greed and replaced it with empathy. The New Deal didn't completely end the Great Depression. That would come later with the start of World War II, but it changed the direction of the country. It gave people jobs. It built roads, schools, bridges, and parks still used today. It reformed banks and protected savings, and it restored faith in democracy at a time when other nations were turning to dictators. It proved that even in crisis, a nation can rise through courage, compassion, and collective action. By 1938, the worst of the Depression was over, but many families were still poor. Still, they were stronger. They had learned to endure, to adapt, and to hope. Roosevelt once said, "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, but whether we provide enough for those who have too little." Those words captured the heart of the New Deal and the heart of an entire generation. The world was beginning to recover, but far away, across oceans, new storms were forming. Storms of war, ambition, and conflict. The Great Depression had changed economies, but it had also changed politics. And soon, those political changes would shake the world again. The Great Depression was more than just a financial crisis. It changed how people lived, how they thought, and how nations ruled. It was a time that reshaped economies, politics, and hearts all around the globe. When the world finally began to recover, it was not the same world it had been before 1929. Everything, from governments to ordinary lives, had changed forever. In the early 1930s, as America struggled with unemployment and hunger, the same story unfolded across continents. Factories in Britain stopped running. Banks in Austria and Germany collapsed. In Canada, farms failed. In Asia, exports of rice, rubber, and tea fell sharply. And in Latin America, nations that depended on selling raw materials suddenly had no buyers. It was like a domino effect, one economy after another falling. The global trading system had broken. No country could stand alone. People everywhere faced the same questions. How will we survive? How can we feed our children? And slowly, from that pain, new ideas and new kinds of governments began to rise. In Germany, the Depression hit especially hard. After World War I, Germany had already been burdened with huge debts and reparations to other countries. Its money had lost value once before, during the 1920s hyperinflation, when a loaf of bread cost millions of marks. Now, in the 1930s, the situation turned even worse. Factories closed, banks failed, unemployment soared. By 1932, nearly 6 million Germans were jobless. Desperation filled the streets. Out of this chaos rose a new political voice: Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party. Hitler promised to restore jobs, rebuild pride, and make Germany strong again. He blamed others, especially Jews and foreign powers, for the country's suffering. Many desperate people believed him. By 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. The democracy that had existed after the war quickly vanished. Newspapers were censored, opponents were jailed, and soon a dictatorship replaced freedom. The same pain that had begun with an economic collapse was now turning into political tyranny. Germany was not alone. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already built his fascist regime, promising stability through power. The Depression made his ideas seem attractive to others. He spoke of national glory, discipline, and empire, and people listened. In Japan, the Depression crippled exports. Factories closed, and soldiers began to gain more power in government. Leaders believed expansion was the answer, to take over lands with resources like Manchuria in China, which Japan invaded in 1931. In Spain, economic tension fueled civil conflict that exploded into the Spanish Civil War by 1936. It became a battlefield of ideas, democracy versus dictatorship, with help from Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. All across the world, people were turning toward leaders who promised quick fixes, strong action, and national pride. The Depression had shaken faith in democracy and opened the door for extremism. Not every nation turned to dictatorship. Some democracies learned from the crisis and began to reform. In Britain, the government faced rising unemployment and falling exports. They cut spending, lowered wages, and left the gold standard, a system that tied money to gold value. Although recovery was slow, Britain managed to avoid collapse by supporting industries like housing and shipping. In Sweden and Norway, something different happened. Social democratic parties came to power. Instead of cutting help, they increased it, introducing welfare systems, unemployment benefits, and housing aid. They believed that governments should care for people during bad times. This model would later inspire countries around the world. These nations showed that democracy could survive if it learned to care for its citizens. Before the Great Depression, most governments followed a simple rule: stay out of business. The idea was that markets would fix themselves, that if prices fell, things would eventually balance. But the Depression shattered that belief. Economist John Maynard Keynes introduced new ideas. He argued that during hard times, governments should spend more, not less. By creating jobs and building projects, they could restart the economy from the bottom up. This was a revolutionary thought, and it worked. It became the foundation for modern economics. From that point on, governments began to take responsibility for employment, welfare, and growth. Taxes increased, but so did public services. The idea of a social safety net to protect people in crisis was born. In America, the New Deal had already begun programs like Social Security and unemployment insurance. Other countries soon followed. In Britain, the Unemployment Act and Housing Acts supported those without work. In France, workers gained paid vacations and shorter working hours. In Canada, unemployment relief became a national policy. In Australia, pensions and public works expanded. The Great Depression taught the world that ignoring poverty could destroy a nation, but helping people could rebuild one. For ordinary families, life in the 1930s changed forever. Before the Depression, many believed that success came only from hard work. If someone failed, it was their fault. But now, people saw that even the hardest workers could lose everything because of forces beyond their control. This realization created a new sense of community and empathy. People began to value kindness, cooperation, and fairness more than wealth and status. Neighbors helped each other rebuild barns. Churches opened food drives. Communities started barter markets, trading goods instead of money. Families learned to save, repair, and reuse everything. A generation grew up learning never to waste food, never to take stability for granted. These lessons lasted for decades. The Depression also changed the role of women. In many families, women became the main managers of survival. They learned to cook creatively, sew clothes from old fabrics, and stretch every dollar. Some women entered the workforce as teachers, secretaries, or nurses, even though jobs were scarce. It wasn't easy. Some people criticized women for working while men were unemployed, but their contribution became vital. By the late 1930s, women had proven they could balance work, home, and hardship. This quiet strength would later inspire the workforce movements of World War II and the women's rights movement after it. The Depression forced millions of people to move. Farmers from the Dust Bowl regions traveled west seeking work. Many settled in California, where agriculture was growing. Others moved from small towns to big cities, hoping to find factory jobs. This migration reshaped America's population map. Cities like Los Angeles grew rapidly. New communities formed, mixing cultures, accents, and traditions. These changes would define modern America. Elsewhere, similar migrations took place. In Britain, workers left northern mining towns for London and the South. In Japan, rural families moved to industrial cities. And in Latin America, people left farms for urban jobs, setting the stage for future modernization. Hard times often create deep art. Writers, photographers, and musicians turned the sadness of the Depression into powerful stories and images. Photographer Dorothea Lange captured haunting pictures of migrant families, faces of mothers holding children filled with exhaustion and strength. Her photo, Migrant Mother, became an icon of human endurance. Writers like John Steinbeck wrote novels such as The Grapes of Wrath and Of Mice and Men, showing the pain and dignity of ordinary people. Painters like Thomas Hart Benton and Grant Wood created murals that celebrated working-class life. Even Hollywood reflected these themes. Films like Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin used humor and sadness to show what people were going through. Art became a mirror of hope and struggle, reminding the world of its shared humanity. By the late 1930s, the world was slowly healing. Unemployment began to fall. Factories reopened. Trade started again. But even as recovery came, memories of the Depression stayed sharp. Governments learned that unchecked greed and lack of regulation could lead to disaster. Banks began to be more strictly controlled. Stock markets introduced new rules to prevent reckless speculation. Economies became more cautious and better prepared. The world had learned, painfully, that prosperity built on debt and illusion could collapse overnight. Even as economies recovered, political tensions were rising again. In Germany, Hitler's dictatorship was turning aggressive. In Italy and Japan, ambitions for empire grew. And in the United States, Roosevelt began strengthening industries, partly to fight unemployment, but also to prepare for what seemed to be coming, another world conflict. Few realized it then, but the Great Depression had already set the stage for World War II. Economic desperation had given rise to powerful dictators, and their hunger for expansion would soon ignite the globe once more. When historians look back, they see that the Great Depression did more than bring suffering. It reshaped civilization. It gave birth to modern social welfare systems, stronger banking and financial laws, the idea of government responsibility for citizens' well-being, a deeper sense of equality and empathy, and the belief that nations could rebuild through unity, not division. It also taught the world a lasting truth. Prosperity without fairness is fragile. The people who lived through the Great Depression became known as the Depression generation. They carried its lessons all their lives. They valued hard work, but also kindness. They were careful with money, but generous with neighbors. They knew the importance of saving, but also of sharing. They believed in community, in faith, and in never giving up. This generation would later face another test, the Second World War, and emerge even stronger. By 1939, 10 years after the crash, the world had transformed. Economies were rebuilding, new governments had formed, and societies had learned resilience. But it was not the same world that had danced through the Roaring Twenties. It was wiser, more cautious, and more aware of how fragile peace and prosperity can be. The Great Depression had left scars, but also seeds of progress. It taught the human race that even in the darkest times, cooperation and compassion could light the way forward. And though the next storm, the Second World War was about to begin, the lessons of the Depression would remain a guide for the generations that followed. The Great Depression was one of the hardest times in modern history. For 10 long years, the world struggled through unemployment, hunger, fear, and uncertainty. But it was also a time of courage, unity, and learning. When it finally ended, humanity emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined never to repeat the same mistakes again. This chapter tells the story of how the world slowly climbed out of the darkness, step by step, and what lessons it left behind for all generations to come. By the late 1930s, change was in the air. The worst of the Depression had passed, but recovery was slow and uneven. Factories were running again, but not at full speed. Farmers were growing crops, but prices remained low. Millions still had no work, yet hope was returning. In America, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal had created jobs, reformed banks, and rebuilt confidence. New bridges crossed rivers, new schools opened in towns, and families once living in despair could see signs of progress. The country was not yet rich again, but it was alive again. Still, it would take something even larger than any government plan to fully end the Great Depression. That something was World War II. When war began in Europe in 1939, few realized it would pull the world completely out of depression. As countries prepared for battle, factories reopened to make weapons, uniforms, and vehicles. Millions of men joined the military, and millions of women entered the workforce for the first time. Demand for goods exploded: steel, rubber, oil, food, machinery. In the United States, factories that had once been silent now worked 24 hours a day. Airplane engines roared, shipyards buzzed with welders, and assembly lines produced tanks instead of cars. The government spent billions, money it didn't have before, but now had to create to fight the war. By 1943, unemployment in the U.S. had fallen to almost zero. The same happened in Britain, Canada, and other allied nations. The war ended the Depression not through peace, but through production, a strange, sad truth of history. When the war ended in 1945, the world faced a new challenge: how to rebuild again, but this time for peace. After the war, countries came together to prevent another global collapse. They had seen what economic despair could do, how it could lead to dictators, conflict, and war. They wanted to build a world based on cooperation, not competition. In 1944, even before the war ended, representatives from 44 countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in the United States. They created new systems to manage global trade and money safely. Two major institutions were born there: the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to help countries stabilize their currencies and prevent financial crises; the World Bank, to lend money to nations rebuilding after the war. These organizations were designed to make sure the world economy never collapsed again like it did in 1929. At the same time, leaders began planning for peace and fairness. In 1945, the United Nations, UN, was founded, an international group to maintain peace, protect human rights, and support development. It was the beginning of a new era of global cooperation. The Great Depression changed how people thought about money, work, and government forever. It left behind lessons that still guide the world today. Let's look at some of the most important ones. 1. The economy must serve the people. Before the Depression, many governments believed that markets could fix everything on their own. But millions of hungry families proved that wasn't true. Economies exist for people, not the other way around. If people suffer, the system is broken. This lesson led to the creation of social safety nets, unemployment benefits, pensions, public health care, and housing support. It became the duty of governments to protect their citizens, especially in hard times. 2. Hope and confidence are as important as money. During the Depression, fear itself made things worse. When people stopped spending, businesses failed. When banks lost trust, savings vanished. The economy froze because confidence disappeared. Leaders like Roosevelt understood this. His words, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," weren't just poetry, they were economic truth. Confidence is the invisible fuel that keeps economies running. 3. Work gives dignity. The New Deal programs taught that a job is more than a paycheck. It's pride, purpose, and self-worth. When people have meaningful work, they contribute to their community and feel part of something larger. That's why public works, like building bridges, parks, and schools, became symbols of renewal. Even today, when countries face economic crises, they often follow the same principle: create jobs first, because employment heals both the economy and the human spirit. 4. Balance between rich and poor keeps society stable. The 1920s were full of inequality. A small group of people held most of the wealth, while millions lived on credit. When the system broke, it was the poor who suffered most. The Depression showed that extreme inequality weakens nations. If wealth is too concentrated, the whole economy becomes fragile. Fair wages, taxes, and opportunities keep society strong and balanced. 5. Global problems need global solutions. The Depression didn't stay in one country, it spread across oceans. That's why after 1945, countries built organizations like the IMF, World Bank, and later trade agreements in unions. They understood that no nation could stand alone in a connected world. Cooperation became the key to stability. Trade, aid, and shared responsibility replaced isolation and greed. The children who grew up during the Depression became adults during World War II. They had seen both hunger and courage, both loss and recovery. They learned the value of hard work, saving, and community. When peace returned, they helped build modern societies. They constructed highways, schools, and cities. They founded companies and universities. They became known as the greatest generation. Not because they were perfect, but because they had endured, adapted, and rebuilt. They taught their children and the world never to forget those years of struggle. The Depression also changed how people approached invention and resourcefulness. Because money was scarce, people became creative. They reused materials, repaired machines, and found new ways to solve old problems. That spirit of innovation carried into the post-war era. New technologies like jet engines, televisions, and computers were developed. The same determination that had helped people survive the 1930s now fueled scientific progress and creativity. From hardship came innovation, a reminder that limitations can lead to breakthroughs. By the mid-20th century, most countries had learned how to prevent another Great Depression. Central banks began controlling money supply carefully. Governments introduced economic stimulus plans when economies slowed. Stock markets were regulated to prevent dangerous speculation. And international trade agreements created more stable connections between nations. These systems weren't perfect, but they worked. Even when smaller recessions happened in later decades, the world didn't collapse the way it had in 1929. The lessons of the Great Depression became built into the DNA of modern economics. Beyond numbers and policies, the Depression left emotional scars that lasted lifetimes. People who lived through it never forgot the feeling of going hungry or losing everything overnight. Even decades later, many continued to save every coin, reuse every jar, and avoid debt. They taught their children to appreciate what they had. But it also left a legacy of empathy, a deep understanding that anyone can fall on hard times. Out of that empathy grew charities, food banks, and volunteer organizations around the world. Human kindness, born from suffering, became one of the Depression's most powerful legacies. Every economic crisis since then, from recessions to financial crashes, reminds us of 1929. Economists study it, politicians quote it, teachers explain it to students. Because it wasn't just about the fall of money, it was about the resilience of humanity. It showed that even when systems fail, people can rise. It proved that courage, compassion, and cooperation can rebuild what greed and fear destroy. The Great Depression became a warning, but also a story of hope. When we look back at that decade of struggle, we see not only despair, but also progress. We see governments learning responsibility, communities discovering unity, and individuals finding strength. From 1929 to 1939, the world walked through fire. It stumbled, it cried, but it did not give up. By the end, the world had new values. Work matters. People matter. Fairness matters. And helping one another is not weakness, it is wisdom. The story of the Great Depression is more than history. It is a mirror. Whenever greed grows unchecked, whenever we forget the poor, or whenever fear replaces compassion, the mirror reminds us of what can happen. But it also reminds us that light can return, that no matter how deep the fall, humanity can rise again. Because from the Dust Bowl plains to the crowded cities, from the soup lines to the halls of power, one truth remained unbroken. When people stand together, no depression, no crisis can last forever. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all.